Hey, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon. I hope you're doing well. It's really snowy and cold here, so we've been stuck inside in like moving cars while they push the snow. I've been working all day and so excited to see you because we're going to do something a little bit more fun today. And it does involve information. We do address the issues for this unit, but we'll do it in a way that is more involved, and there will be some back and forth. And I have a way of doing this that I think will be more interesting than usual. Now, the first thing I want to tell you though is that I'm no longer assigning the Lieberman reading. Um, I made a small change and decided that it wasn't useful for us anymore. I apologize if you've completed that reading already. It is a useful and interesting piece for other reasons, but it just might not be something that we um, include on the midterm. And I think that in general, I'm just going to kind of cross it off because it doesn't really feed as closely into the topic that I wanted to discuss as I now think. So with that being said, I don't plan to replace that reading with anything because as you'll see, much of the discussion builds on what we already know about different perspectives and ways of voting. And so you'll see then that there's a lot here that we recognize, but also some new issues that we'll begin to discuss more on Friday after we kind of introduce things today. So let's go ahead and get started. Hey, Jacqueline. Hey, Oscar. Good to see everybody. Okay, so information. It's anywhere and everywhere, including in all of the theories of voting behavior that we've studied so far. You've noticed, no doubt, that all of these theories make certain assumptions about how voters obtain or process information, how comprehensively they examine and consider information, how they use information to make decisions. A lot of times, these assumptions are sort of implicit or more or less just sort of left unsaid. But for example, we know that the sociological school, the Michigan school that is, really views voters as relatively unsophisticated. They don't have much knowledge of politics or information. Generally speaking, they are uninformed in making decisions based on how they've been socialized. Economic voting, on the other hand, we know is really all about being fully informed, considering all the alternatives, making a rational choice, assessing the alternatives in terms of costs and benefits, etc. It's very different. These are two perspectives among many that we will eventually begin to address today and Friday. And the way that we'll discuss these today is by taking a look at and reading some descriptions of some hypothetical voters and the ways that they use and respond to and incorporate and process information in the process of an election and as they begin to make their decision about how they will vote. We'll read these descriptions and we'll use these descriptions to think about what model of voting behavior seems to be represented in those descriptions. And so this will involve you, and you'll be reading this and thinking about this and looking for little pieces that seem to align or fit along with some of the models or not, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, let's get started. We have our first hypothetical voter, William R. William R. is an accountant working for Xerox in Rochester, New York. He believes the only way to pick a president is to learn everything there is to know about the candidate's experience and policy proposals and to evaluate the likely consequences of those policies for his family and himself. He watches NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on PBS and scours the newspapers daily for information about the candidates. He could tell you the minutest detail about George W. Bush's plans for post-war Iraq, his stand on immigration or the environment, John Kerry's record as senator from Massachusetts, his feelings about corporate business practices, and so on. Aided by his photographic memory, he took the weekend before the election off so he could integrate what he learned about the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate into overall summary evaluations. George Bush came out with the highest total and thus earned Williams' vote. This is our first hypothetical voter. And I want you to kind of just pause and sit back for a moment and think about this description and think about, what kind of a person, what kind of a voter, what kind of an information processor William is. And what we'll do is we will address this by opening up a poll. And I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll right now so that I can bring up the description that I just gave you and have both of them pictured at the same time. I'm launching the poll and I'm going back to the description slide. And I'd like you to read this and consider this and think about this before you respond. Got the votes rolling in. Curious about how you're processing the information as you determine your vote choice. This is always fun. We got 54% of the total, 62%. It's pretty close, actually. It's not a decisive outcome so far. Got 77% of the vote in. We've got 91% of the vote in. 4 of you have yet to vote. Got 95% in. 2 more votes still out. 1 more vote out. 97% in. We're just about done here. Just about done. 1 more vote out. If you get to vote, please do cast your vote. So 97% of the vote is in. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So as you can see, 20 of you, or 42% of you, chose A, economic voter. 9 of you, or 19% of you, chose B, partisan voter. 8 of you, or 17% of you, chose C, both A and B, both partisan and economic voter, in other words. And 11 of you, or 23%, chose D, none of the above. Now, this is an interesting distribution because it suggests that it may not be that evident. It may sort of seem mixed, and there might be a variety of ways we can look at this and interpret the behavior of William R. Before I show you the answer, I'd like to hear from some students who chose A, B, C, or D. Those of you who chose partisan voter, does someone want to share why they chose partisan voter or what they picked out that seemed to fit that label? 9 of you chose partisan voter or B. Does someone want to just share in the chat or over the mic what it is that tipped you off that suggested that partisan voter was the correct answer? Well, someone should speak up. We're waiting.
Um, I voted for the answer with both with economic and partisan voting, but the reason why I kind of thought partisan was because um, he decided on his stance on like social issues like immigration and the environment.
Okay.
So that's why I was kind of thinking a little bit about partisan.
Yeah. So maybe it didn't appear as though there was a lot of like economic considerations. And so maybe the social issues had something to do with the partisan choice. Okay. Let's hear from someone who chose economic voter. What did you pick out, or what seemed to be consistent with that label from this description?
I picked out
Um,
two things. Um, what stood out to me was to evaluate the likely consequences of those policies for his family and himself. So, if this was an incumbent candidate, it would most likely be through economic voting that he would choose who he would vote for. And it didn't seem like he was more of like a partisan voter because at the end it said George Bush came out with the highest total that's earned Williams votes. So he's not really choosing George Bush due to his party, but more to the benefits that he would receive by voting for George Bush.
It's interesting. It's kind of like he goes through this objective process and he's like, well, George Bush won the race the way I set it up. And so I'll choose George Bush. And he's engaged in this evaluation, as Hope points out. He's sort of thinking about, what's the best candidate for my family in terms of how I'm evaluating them in these strengths and weaknesses in these different areas. Seems very analytical, right? He seems very, very much an accountant. Those of you who said none of the above, does someone want to talk a little bit about why they chose none of the above?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about it because I think of an economic voter as someone who thinks more about like, what are they going to do for my tax reform? What are they going to do for like, this particular issue? And while he did that, he didn't seem to be as like economically motivated as I would expect like an accountant to be. He seemed a little bit more just socially interested.
Hmm.
And in the same way, he definitely didn't seem partisan to me because he wasn't like, oh, I'm a Republican, so I have to vote for Bush. So because he didn't fit perfectly either of those, I figured he fit none of them, and I put none of the above.
Good reasoning. Yeah, that's totally sound, and I see that too. Right? He's sort of assessing, as Josette pointed out, these like social issues. He's concerned about things that might not seem to be directly tied to his pocketbook or his bottom line. Um, and as you point out, also, he doesn't seem to be a partisan, right? He's sort of, he's just choosing the candidate that in his estimation seems to sort of test the best. And of course, he's considering the various strengths and weaknesses, whatever model that he uses to analyze the candidates. Um, Interesting. Yeah, that's a solid rationale. Everything we've heard so far is solid, and you're interpreting this information in a way that is coherent. And though there is an answer to this question, and I'll share it in a moment. I applaud all of you for thinking about the information and thinking about why you know William might be this type of voter or this type of voter. Before we continue, and before I give you the answer, does anyone want to talk a little bit more about why they chose A, B, C, or D?
I chose D and probably mimicking the same answers as the last person because I wouldn't word it as like just social issues, but like values, personal values, individual values, family values. So, I mean, that could be so you could categorize it under social, but he specifically talked about him and his family. And then, you know, the fact that he laid like a pros and cons and did his homework made it so I couldn't pick partisan at all. And then economically, I would have liked to see something with like dollar signs attached to it, like taxes.
I
Uh,
see.
so that's yeah. I mean, I guess you could say that he's an economic voter if you were to categorize his values with like actual money, like, like if his social values or his family values had some kind of monetary percentage or dollar amount put on it, then sure, you can make him a full-blown economic voter.
Okay. Now, this is interesting. Christopher's kind of feeding into a good question for us, which is, what would we need to see? Or for those of you who said that William is not an economic voter, what would you need to see apart from maybe just mention of economic policies that would persuade you that he was actually an economic voter?
Maybe dissatisfaction with the current economic state of the country.
Okay. So this is good. I'm seeing a lot of consistency here, and you certainly understand that the substance of economic voting and the way in which, we're thinking about, dollar signs, right? And the bottom line, and do we have to tighten our belts or loosen them, and these kinds of issues, meat and potatoes, these things. And that certainly is economic. That certainly is material. And in a very literal way, it is economic. Hope says, I'm not sure if this is how we are supposed to interpret it, but I view economic voting as objective and partisan voting as more subjective. Hope is making an interesting point here, which is that it could be that economic voting could be sort of like a method, right? It could be that you do care about economic policies, but you might care about them and analyze them economically. In addition to considering the economic policies, then you're actually engaged in this sort of calculation, right, of costs and benefits. The policies you are engaging in the calculation of the costs and benefits of, they might be economic, they might be social, but the process itself, the decision-making process, the process of processing information, it's economic in the sense that William is engaged in this calculation. He's evaluating the costs and the benefits and the pros and the cons in the relative gain or loss of the different alternatives. He's thinking analytically, and he's thinking carefully in terms of this objective set of criteria. And most importantly, he's thinking in terms of all of the information available to him. He's doing everything in his power to become fully informed. That is a critical component of economic voting. Remember that economic voting has to do with this calculation and this assessment of the costs and the benefits and this rational choice. You ultimately choose the candidate based upon who is the rational choice and who will benefit you more in terms of the bottom line or the state of the national economy. It's possible, and I fully understand and I agree that the lack of emphasis on economic policy may have thrown some of us off. But the emphasis on full and complete information in the way in which William is calculating and processing information and engaging in this objective sort of assessment, that is purely economic. And he is a classic rational choice sort of economic voter. Hope says, I say partisan is more subjective because partisan voting is kind of like a combination of media, name recognition, and things of that nature rather than actually looking at the numbers and statistics. Okay, Christopher. Christopher says, I saw the answer and I still chose something different. So Christopher, what would you need to see then for this to be economic voting? Is it just the economic policies that are missing here?
No, it's kind of like what I said in the other class about partisanship pulling on heartstrings. You can give an anecdote or a family story or something that might have to do with economics, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily evidence. It's just like one case study. It's not like an aggregate level study where like we're doing all kinds of families, because your family may not be the same as other families. So that's kind of why I chose that.
Let me pause right there and just ask you though. So you don't agree that Williams' process and thought process here is sort of economic and calculating and rational in the way that he tries to assess the costs and the benefits of the different alternatives? Do you disagree that that's economic?
No, I could agree that it's I mean, I took geometry and I know what proofs are and how you can relate that to numbers. So, I mean, I get that part of it. I'd agree with that part, But like I said, just because it's him and his family, he may have millions of dollars, whereas my family, everybody in their household only makes 40 to 60,000 a year. So my economics or my consequences for family based on a candidate's PBS spiel or newspaper report would be different when I look at it.
But remember, though, that that might not be relevant because pocketbook voting is one form of economic voting, and that pertains to oneself or family. And really, I don't know if it's fully relevant because the point is that every individual is engaged in a process of seeking information and making a choice on this sort of rational basis, right? They're trying to engage in this economic analysis. How accurate or truthful that analysis is, or how far it pertains, or how widely it applies to families, I just don't know if that's as relevant because this is primarily about how William, as an individual, is choosing to vote. And so I want us to remember that we're in the heads of individual voters. That's where we are. We're not making decisions about what fits or doesn't fit with um, necessarily the whole. But Christopher, opinionated truth versus factual truth. But it's not, the question isn't whether what he's considering is true or not. It's about his thought process and his process of processing information. And so the truthiness of it is sort of a separate question. But I appreciate and admire your critical eye. So the answer to this question is that William is an economic voter. He represents the classic economic voter in the sense that he is engaged in this rational process of assessment. He's considering information. He's engaging in an analysis of costs and benefits. He's looking at the alternatives, and he's ultimately making a choice that is dispassionate, that is sterile, and that was not, foretold and preordained and not determined by, some process of socialization. It was fundamentally about the results that he arrived at through his sort of sterile economic analysis. Now, those of you who said there was no emphasis on economic policy, this is true. This is true. There was no emphasis on that. But I would also suggest, though, that even some of these other things can still affect the economy, right? His feelings about corporate business practices, um, detail about the plans for post-war Iraq, that would obviously involve enormous costs, and it would require the financing of the United States, and so that would have an economic impact. His stand on immigration or the environment, those are also mainly, well, the environment is an economic issue. And so I want you to think broadly in sort of more, I think, inclusively about what is economic and what is not. Just because it's not about the strength of the dollar or the tariffs on China doesn't mean that it's not economic. You can still evaluate something that's social in an economic way. And even before that, the environment, corporate business practices, post-war Iraq, and the U.S. involvement, those are economic issues. Post-war Iraq is a foreign policy issue, but it also implicates the economy, especially when it was and continues to be such an enormous expense. And so I just want us to think about the process of thought that voters engage in, as well as the nature of the information. And so this is William. Now we're going to consider Anne. Anne is a new voter. We're going to do a similar thing with Anne. Ann D is a business consultant in San Diego. Time is money, she always says, and even though she believes that candidates have to be evaluated according to the likely consequences of their winning, she feels it is simply not worth the effort to pay any attention to campaigns until near the end. She never votes in primary elections and considers only the Democratic and Republican candidates because no other candidate has a chance of winning. She evaluates candidates primarily in terms of how likely they are to have any tangible effect on her own pocketbook. She gladly accepted her $500 tax refund the year before the election, but business has been very poor since President Bush took office, and she has made much less from her consulting job since the 2000 election than she remembers making during the boom years under Clinton and Gore. Although she has voted Republican in the past, Kerry and the Democrats seem like the obvious choice to Ann this year. This is Ann. Meet Ann, the business consultant from San Diego. I'm going to launch another poll so that we can also answer the question that I have for you regarding this. And that question is, based on how she processes information related to the election, what kind of voter does Anne represent? And so I am going to launch a new poll. And there you go. Let's take a moment to answer this, and we'll do something similar.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, Orlando.
So about the previous example, when you were saying that we need to pay attention to other cues that give hints to like the economy, would you say that treat it like almost like stocks, in the sense that although you keep an eye on the news to see that certain companies or certain businesses or corporations are doing better, you would put money in there so that you end up having or reaping the benefits and saving your money when things are looking bad?
Totally. I mean, I think that's analogous. You know, you think about it like the accumulation of like some resource or some capital. You have a vote. You know, you want to vote in a way that gets you the most bang for your vote, right? So you vote for the candidate you've watched all the candidates closely, right? But you choose the one that according to your forecast will benefit you the most. And so in that regard, you make this choice very much like how you might choose a stock to invest in, based on some forecast that you come up with. So yeah, I think that's analogous for sure.
Sorry, Professor, could you go back to the like words, like the explanation of Anne, please?
Yeah, so the description. Oh yes,
Yes.
sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.
So as long as it is cost versus benefit, it will always be economic voting. Well, Christopher, remember that economic voting also involves complete evidence, or this assessment of all of the available information. And obviously that's an unrealistic expectation and assumption, but the point is that the classic economic voting model treats voters as fully informed. And so if the voter is considering all of the information, that would likely fit if they're engaging in this cost benefit analysis. But if they're not using all the information, well, that might be something else. And I'll leave this up to you, and we'll get to this here in a moment. this one's tougher. I feel I'm laughing a little, not at you, with you. It's it's not a trick question, but it's a tough question, and it's one that we have to really think about. And I'm going to tell you that I think that there might be a few different responses that would be arguable here. We're just about done. 39 of us, or 82% of us, have voted. Anne is quite different than William. Or maybe not. Depends on what you think. Christopher says she does not care and switches parties. But keep in mind, though, economic voting does permit party switching. I mean, that's possible. Hope asks, is focusing on yourself and your benefit count as economic voting? It can, right? It can, absolutely. But there's an important twist here, which is that the sort of classic economic voting model treats the voter as fully informed and assumes that they obtain all possible information and that they don't take shortcuts. That's the key. They fully inform themselves in the course of making their economic choice. It's something slightly different, though, potentially, if they're not obtaining all of the information and if they're taking shortcuts. That becomes something slightly different. I just mean like using heuristics, like picking out maybe a couple issues that they think matter the most and then ignoring the others. And so maybe picking out one or two economic policies instead of looking at, maybe the whole spectrum of policies. They pick out the ones that for whatever reason they think are more important and they ignore the others. They're making decisions based on, these little shortcuts or these heuristics, things that they think are diagnostic that tell them more, that tell them about the larger political climate in the overall picture, despite that it's just part of it. So it looks like virtually all of us are done here. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. As you can see, yet again, economic voting appears to prevail. 15 of you, or 34%, chose economic voting. But what's striking is that that's a bare plurality. It doesn't appear to be a real decisive result for economic voting. And before we continue, does someone want to just tell us why they chose economic voter for this one?
Yeah, so I know for me, I chose economic voter for a lot of the reasons you just kind of helped explain in the last hypothetical. She definitely was looking at it in a pocketbook situation, which you said was a type of economic voting. And she didn't seem as partisan, although she thought about like those political aspects. She wasn't like sticking to being a Republican when the Democratic options fit her better.
Okay. Okay. So she doesn't seem like a partisan, right? Because she's sort of switching, and the pocketbook voting sticks out, as Brittany points out. And that word pocketbook is an important word, right? Because it seems to really convey a lot of information about her thought process and her psychology and what's really important to Anne. Um, good, Brittany. Let's hear from someone who chose partisan voter. You know what? Does someone want to talk a little bit about why they maybe chose either partisan voter or C, both A and B?
I kind
Um, sorry, go ahead.
no, it's all right. You can go.
Oh, I was just gonna say I chose partisan because she seems to care a lot more about their political parties or like the impressions that the candidates give rather than like full on like economic values that they have.
Okay. And so she seems partisan, maybe, and maybe the economic considerations don't seem as important. So there was someone else who was going to make a comment. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, because I wanted to take into consideration that at the end, there is some sort of remembrance of how good the economy was under Clinton and Gore. So that might give off a partisan impression. But since there is, as somebody had stated before, a lot of mention of pocketbook voting, then it kind of gave me the impression of she might be a little bit partisan, but she also might be a little bit economic.
Yeah, okay, good. Right? Like she's sort of evaluating or reevaluating the parties based on their performance, and she's thinking about that through her own lens and how it'll affect her pocketbook. That's a very good, that's a very well reasoned response, Lila. And I see that as consistent and coherent, and I wouldn't dispute that. It's interesting and noteworthy that when you really think about individuals, and these are hypotheticals, you can start to see the complexity, right? And how complex political psychology really is, and how the minds of people are not simple. Even in those cases that seem relatively straightforward, there really are a lot of considerations. And I'd like to hear from someone who maybe put down D, none of the above. Does someone want to comment briefly on why they chose D?
It didn't seem like she was really loyal to any party, and it seemed like she was voting more for like individualistic purposes, which I don't really see as economic voting, like being more like that. Like I see economic voting as like looking at it as a whole rather than just yourself. So she didn't really seem loyal to anything and maybe like flip-flopping, especially since she's a new voter. So that's why I picked D, because it didn't seem like she was showing traits of like both partisan and economic voting, but at the same time also showing none. So I felt like D was the safest choice.
For sure. Yeah, because partisan voting and economic voting don't actually sit super comfortably together because they're kind of different in terms of the logic. And so when it comes down to it, maybe none of the above is a safe choice when it's not clear that she's either an economic voter or a partisan voter. And I hear that, and I think that that's a coherent and well-reasoned response as well. And I would agree that Anne seems a little bit ambiguous, right? Sort of like a chameleon. It doesn't appear to be any rhyme or reason, maybe with the exception of some economic um, reasoning. But as you'll see in a moment, even there are some limits that are important and that aren't necessarily neatly captured by the models that we've considered so far. Carlos says, I chose none of the above because she does not consider any other party other than Democrats and Republicans, so there is no effort to seek other candidates' policies, and she switches too much to be partisan. I see. All right, Carlos. It sounds like, from your perspective, Carlos, she's not considering all of the information and she's not assessing all of the alternatives. From that perspective, it may be difficult to say that she's a pure economic voter if we were inclined to say that based on her pocketbook voting. Very interesting. Also notable that she doesn't appear to be a partisan because she's switching. That's important too. And Christopher says, D, she is wishy-washy and is not informed, like a classic economic voter. Touche, touche. I'm here for it. This is good. You're really picking up what I'm laying down here, and I appreciate that. This is the question, as you know, and so here's the deal, everyone. It is D, but as you see, she does seem like an economic voter because she's engaged in pocketbook voting. She's reevaluating parties based upon their performance. But here's the key. She's not considering all of the information. She's operating under a set of constraints that are, kind of limiting her point of view. She's optimizing under constraints, as we would call it. She's looking at a few things, maybe a few items, few considerations, and she's making her decision based on that. It is an economic decision, essentially, but she's not fully informed and she's not obtaining and seeking all of the information in the way that the classic economic model assumes voters actually do. And so this is going to be something more along the lines of what's been called optimizing under constraints. The idea that, well, people and voters are relatively rational. It's just that they're boundedly rational. There's a sort of limit to how rational they are and how much information they can actually obtain, and they make those choices and they impose those limits based on their own personal circumstances and considerations. And so from the perspective of optimizing under constraints, William begins to look like a very, very accountant like voter indeed, creating spreadsheets, analyzing, assessing all the information, considering all the alternatives, and by contrast appears to be making decisions under binding constraints or optimizing under constraints, not considering all the information, etc.
I have a question.
Yes, Hope.
When it said in Anne's description that she only votes for the Democrats and the Republicans because they're the only parties that matter, is that due to logic or is that due to like what she's been taught? Because like I know in my experience, like I don't vote third party because I know that like they won't win, but that's not really due to logic. It's more because that's what I was taught. So like in what way would we be able to measure that? Do you know?
I think it is actually pretty logical. Like, the truth is we have single member districts and winner take all rules. So, if you win a district, you take that district. And so by extension, only two parties usually will really compete because voters know that it's only going to be one of two parties who really win. And because the system punishes those small parties who can't win districts, I would consider it pretty rational for voters to look at the rules and say, well, I know that third parties don't have a chance. Why would I waste my vote? Therefore, I'm going to cast my vote in favor of, the most viable, or the candidate who is viable, who I most like, or who I most see myself benefiting from, right? So like there are some viable candidates and there are some inviable candidates. Rationally, maybe you choose the viable candidate who's closest to you, even if in truth, the candidate who's ideologically closest to you might be like a third party candidate, somewhere else. So like, Jill Stein, right? I know she's controversial, but a lot of people liked Jill Stein, but not many people voted for Jill Stein because Jill Stein, ran under the Green Party label and had no shot at winning. And it's because of our single member district system that's the case. So I think that's a rational choice, Hope. That's a rational choice. Voters are behaving strategically and voting in a way that doesn't waste their vote. But it's also the case that we've been taught this too. So there's certainly a cognitive component as well. Christopher says I voted for Jill in Howie this past election. Well, right on. But Christopher, there aren't many like you. This is the truth. Even in a good election for a third party, they're very unlikely to win more than 1% of the vote. So it has to do a lot with our recognition that the electoral system punishes small parties and creates barriers to entry that are insurmountable for them. And it at the same time, for the same reason, benefits large parties. And the Democrats and the Republicans are those large parties. Okay, so we're going to go to hypothetical voter 3. This is fun. This is Warren M. And Warren M is a new case. Warren M is a shift supervisor in an automobile factory living in a middle-class neighborhood in Detroit. A lifelong Democrat, as were his parents, Warren found the decision to vote for John Kerry an easy one. He believes that Kerry has superior political experience compared to George Bush, and he trusts him a lot more than any Republican. As a Democrat, he cares about a strong economy and believes Kerry has better plans for getting the economy going again than does Bush. As a father with 2 teenage boys, he is delighted that his candidate will do everything he can to keep us out of war. And of course, he is disgusted with how President Bush has been distorting Kerry's war record during the campaign. All of these concerns pushed him toward the Democratic ticket. This is Warren. Warren, the shift supervisor in an automobile factory. Now, as before, I'm going to present you with a poll, and it will contain the same question. And I want you to, again, think about this information and cast a vote in favor of the type of voter that you think Warren is based on this information. So I'm going to stop sharing that last poll, and here's the new one. We are off and running. One of them is coming in hot. These examples are fun because you really do, you get into this, like the psychology of the voter and how they make choices based on their circumstances and how and to what degree they fit with our theoretical models of voting behavior. And as you can see, that some of these don't fit neatly, especially with some of the classical theories, some of the older ones.
I just have a question. Will we ever be given like actual tests like this? Because I don't think I'm doing very well so far.
No. The questions that you'll get will be a little more focused, and this is a little more exploratory. I'm not, I'm not expecting us to nail all of these or even many of them. So don't worry about that. And moreover, the midterm will be preceded by a study guide, and we'll talk a lot in class about all of the above. So don't worry about that. We'll be in great shape. This is just for fun, and this is a way for us to explore these models and get to know the information processing of the different types of voters.
Thank you.
No problem, Brittany. We're just about done. We've got 89% of the vote in. The AP cannot yet call this race. Actually, I think it can, but I still want to hear from the 5 who've yet to vote. I'm glad that we were able to clear that up. Yeah, don't worry at this stage. We're just having fun. We're trying to make the most of this content, and it is fun. I'm enjoying this. I always enjoy it, but this is especially fun. So almost all of you have voted, and I'm going to go ahead and share the results. As you can see, that it was a landslide victory for partisan voter B. 29 of you, or 67%, chose partisan voter. And before I show you the result, I would just like to hear from some of you who chose partisan voter. Why did you choose B?
Well, it was clear to me the way it was written that partisanship for Warren was being used as the shortcut in order to make the decision about who he was going to vote for. And sort of the way it's written here is he mentions a Democrat as a lifelong Democrat a couple of times throughout the paragraph here, and also examines the issues through that partisan lens.
Yes, exactly. Good, Ishan. So, not only does he identify avowedly as a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, but his evaluation of the issues themselves is colored by his partisanship, right? So he's not engaged in this William accountant-like assessment. He's thinking more in a partisan way in terms of the lens that he's adopted or he's been socialized into. He's viewing everything in that way, and sort of to the in some ways this is what partisan voting can lead to. This kind of bias, if you will, or this tendency to see things through this lens. And I think that in the past, Christopher's actually sort of talked about this and equated it with that. And so that's what makes me think of this. I'm going to go to the chat and check out what some of the Christopher says. He does not trust Republicans. Sounds like an old blue dog. So there's like a consideration of trust, right? It's not an issue of an assessment of costs and benefits. It's about something deeper, like a value, right? I don't trust them. They won't do right by me. This sort of thing. That's something that comes from socialization, right? That's something that you're socialized into. That's a view and a worldview, a normative perspective that you've been given, more or less, or that you've absorbed or been brought to through your upbringing with your parents. This is the absolute essence of partisan voting. Warren is the classic partisan voter. He is not just very, very much a partisan, but he's also engaged in an evaluation of the candidates in a way that looks at them through a partisan lens. And that's the essence of a partisan voter, one whose mind is made up, more or less, and who votes that way because they were taught to vote that way, and because that's how they've come to view the world. This is the nature of partisan voting. And so what you've seen so far, everyone, is that all of these models, economic voting, partisan voting, they make different assumptions about how voters process information. Economic voting views voters as rational and fully informed, desirous of more information, engaging in this tedious assessment of the costs and benefits, scouring the newspapers. Partisan voter models, by contrast, by sharp contrast, view voters as relatively uninformed, relatively uninterested in information, and really driven primarily by cognitive and socialization factors that have decided their vote for them and shaped them to become the voters that they are. And so this is why socialization is such a learned and acquired sort of behavior, or it's not a behavior, but this is why socialization leads to such path dependence, if you will, because people begin to vote that way and they never change. They just always vote that way. That's the nature of partisan voting. But one potential challenge to this view would be if we discovered that Warren changed parties later on. Of course, he's a hypothetical voter, so we don't even know if he exists. But the whole point is that partisan voting is is all about those cognitive shortcuts and really about cognitive consistency above all, right? Kind of consistent with your past behavior or your upbringing, you'll vote for X party or Y party. So on Friday, everybody, we'll do a couple more of these and we'll get into some more detailed treatments of the theories and the ideas related to information processing and partisan and economic voting. I've had a lot of fun doing this. Thanks so much for participating and being a part of it. We'll finish this up and get into a more detailed lecture on Friday, and I'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.